Good evening to everybody out there. How are you this fine evening, safe at home, I hope. Thanks for joining us in this new virtual format and tuning in to our second live webinar. I'm Jill Miranda Baker, Executive Director of Keys History and Discovery Center, and 6 feet away from me is Aaron Muir, our Manager of Membership and Events and newly appointed Tech Guru. While we really miss seeing everyone, we are so happy to have the ability and your interest to continue our lecture series almost as planned in this new medium. While the museum remains closed, we continue providing you with some distractions during this unprecedented time. Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 a.m., curator Brad Bertelli goes live on Facebook, and on Mondays at 1 p.m., Blake Terry with Moat Marine and our resident aquarium biologist goes live. You don't need to be a Facebook user to tune in your search bar. Just type Florida Keys History and Discovery Center on Facebook, and our page should appear. After tonight, 2 lectures are scheduled. April 29th, Death at Indian Key, an unusual Indian attack. And on May 13th, Environmental Threats to Florida Iconic Crustaceans. We are exploring offering 1 lecture each via the webinar in June and July. We will keep you informed. We are so appreciative of all those who have chosen to join, reactivate, upgrade, refer since the launch of our spring membership drive on March 1st. While the membership drive continues, we are sensitive to the uncertainty facing both our local economy and personal household finances due to the ongoing crisis. With that in mind, we are extending the time frame of the membership drive and will reschedule at a later date the drawing for our amazing Key West excursion. For those that are able, your continued support and participation in our spring membership drive is greatly appreciated and critical to our sustainability now more than ever. Now for some GoToWebinar housekeeping items. You should all see the GoToWebinar viewer, which contains both the presentation slides and the webcam view. If you are on a computer, this is to the left of your screen. If you are viewing on an iPhone, you will need to swipe left and right to switch between the presentation and the presenter. On your computer, the control panel is located to the right. If your control panel collapses, the orange arrow allows you to expand it again. On a tablet or phone, the control features are at the top or top and bottom. If you have a technical question for Aaron or myself, you can type that into the questions panel during the presentation. If you have a question for John, our speaker, we ask that you hold these until the question and answer segment at the end. We will review the raise your hand feature at the start of the Q&A segment. If you experience a drop in bandwidth during the lecture, you can choose to watch just the webcam view or just the slide presentation view. Audio will continue with either screen. Tonight, for our second lecture, which is offered in part through a grant from Florida Humanities, we offer this webinar from Islamorada and from Tampa. We did a practice run and fingers crossed we got this. Now I will introduce John Capouya, who teaches journalism and nonfiction narrative at the University of Tampa and works with private writing clients. During his journalism career, he was an editor at Newsweek and Smart Money magazines, as well as New York Newsday and the New York Times. He is the author of 3 nonfiction books, including Gorgeous George, a biography of the flamboyant wrestler and pulp culture figure. His most recent book, Florida Soul, tonight's topic, has been called Compelling by the Wall Street Journal. And you will have a chance to purchase an autographed copy of the book after tonight's lecture. John, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad under the circumstances that we can be together. My wife and I were really looking forward to coming down there. We've never been to the Keys, but it's great that we can do this instead. So I'm very grateful to the center and to Ms. Baker and Ms. Muir for making this work. And thank you all for joining in what I know is kind of a strange time. So as you know, the topic is soul music in Florida. And the genesis of this book here was this was basically a 5-year labor of love that I really enjoyed. And the catalyst of this project was when I moved down here some time ago to begin teaching at the University of Tampa. I started to realize that many of the great soul music artists, the singers, the musicians that I grew up on and whose music I loved had Florida roots. And I think when most people think about soul music in the United States, which is we invented soul music, we own it. We think about Motown, Detroit. Memphis is a great soul music town where Otis and Booker T and the MGs recorded. New Orleans is a great rhythm and blues town, but people didn't seem to be thinking about Florida. And I realized that not only was I not aware of this, but many, if not most, Floridians were not as well. So that's the genesis of this project. And now I'm going to show you the presentation and play you some music, which you may recognize if you're of vaguely my generation. I hope you do. And then at the end, we'll have some questions. So let me get this presentation up here. Okay, you're seeing that? Yes?
Yes, we've got it.
Okay, thanks a lot. So when I moved down here, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I didn't even know that this gentleman, the great Ray Charles, was a Floridian. And I think this is probably the reason why. Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through. You know, he sang that song so sincerely that I thought he must be from Georgia. But as it turns out, he grew up in a little town in the north called Greenville, and he went to the St. Augustine School for the Deaf and Blind. He became a musician here. He had his first professional gigs here. He wrote his first songs here. And in fact, he actually wrote several songs about this home state. This is his home. It still stands. They have some plans to make it into a kind of museum, but basically they haven't been able to do that. So he wrote several songs that evoke the home state. And here's one of them from very early in his career. And you'll hear he's still basically a blues musician at this point. He hasn't really coined the form of soul that we know him best for. Down in St. Pete, Florida, I found my baby there. Ooh, St. Pete, Florida. So after my book came out a little more than a year ago, the city of St. Petersburg named that the official song of St. Pete. And we had a ceremony, the mayor made a proclamation. So that was kind of a fun result that I didn't expect. So before we get into more of Florida's contribution, I just want to put us all on the same page in terms of what soul music really is. as I say here in the book, it's gospel style singing on top of blues and jazz instrumentals. Back in that previous song, I think you could hear it's very much still a blues thing. This is from 1949 or 1950, before the soul era, which we consider to be the 60s and the 70s. And actually, this woman who was one of my teachers at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, Phil Garland, called it a fusion of blues, jazz, and gospel. So, do any of you remember Sam and Dave? Right? Well, they are associated with Memphis because they recorded their biggest hits on Stax Records, which was located there. But actually, Sam Moore, who's on my right here, with the microphone close to his face, he grew up in Overtown, African-American neighborhood in Miami. That's where he met Dave Prater, who was from Georgia. They formed their group there. They recorded their first songs there. They had their first success there, so much so that they were invited to go to Stax in Memphis and record, where they had their #1 hits. Here's one of them that you may remember.
Coming to you on a tough road. Good living, I've got a truckload. But when you get it, you got something. Don't worry, cause I'm coming. I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man. I'm a soul man.
So I think this was actually second in my discoveries, that Sam and Dave had their roots in Florida. This is very early on in a nightclub in Liberty City, another African-American neighborhood in Miami. And I actually interviewed Sam Moore for my book. He's a whole chapter in there. I couldn't interview Ray Charles, obviously. So now I'm thinking, wow, Ray Charles and Sam and Dave, they were two of the biggest performers in soul music that I can think of, and they're both from Florida. Who knew? If you're anything around my age, you may remember this song and the dance, The Twist. This is actually some students at Florida State University doing this crazy little dance. And this was a huge hit in the early 1960s, 1960, 61. So much so that President Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy were twisting in the White House. They were twisting in the Soviet Union, where they tried to ban it. I mean, it was probably the biggest song and dance craze of a boomer's lifetime. Chubby Checker recorded that record. However, The Twist was actually written by this gentleman, Hank Ballard, of Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, who had a lot of rhythm and blues hits. And he was inspired to write this song when he was performing in Tampa, and he saw some teenage girls on Central Avenue, which was the center of the Black business and entertainment district, doing this crazy little dance and swiveling their hips. And he asked them what it is, and they said, it's a little thing we made up, and we call it the twist. So he wrote the song. He immediately went to Miami and recorded it. So the first recording of this global hit happened in Florida. And then he recorded it once more. And then Dick Clark, who had the television show American Bandstand, you may remember, he got this young guy, named him Chubby Checker, and had him cover Hank Ballard's song. And then the rest is history, or as I say in the book, twistery. So this is Central Avenue, and you could see here, there's nightclubs. There's one called the Cotton Club here. In the South and in Florida, there were many clubs in the Black entertainment districts in the cities that were named after clubs in Harlem. So you see the Apollo, the Cotton Club, Small's Paradise, things like that. So here's the original twist that was inspired and written in Florida.
Come on, baby. Come on, baby. Take me by my little hand and go like this.
So incidentally, if you want to turn the music up in your living room and do some dancing, I think that would be encouraged. So I found that out. So we've got the twist, Ray Charles and Sam and Dave. And you know, I never thought about what the sunshine in KC and the Sunshine Band referred to, but it's Floridian Sunshine, and they are a Miami band. Here, I think, I'm not sure if that's Mike Douglas or Merv Griffin or one of those television hosts of the day. This KC here, which was a biracial and multi-ethnic band, which wasn't very common at the time. And of course, you may remember, you probably still hear these songs played at every bar mitzvah and wedding, even though they were recorded 50 years ago.
John, we're losing the sound on this one just a little bit. I'm not sure. There we go.
Okay, can you hear that okay?
It came back. We missed the first part of that, but we caught the tail end, and I think everybody knows that song pretty well.
Yeah, so some people consider them to be more disco than soul. And I interviewed Harry Wayne Casey, that's KC, and he was pretty adamant that he considered his music R&B or soul. And I wanted to claim him for my book since they were so successful, so I put him in there. So these are some of the most successful and best known acts in popular music of the time. They all have Florida roots. Here's another gentleman who's less well known, but very successful. He was just inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame. I went there. He lives here near Tampa, and he is famous for a hit called Let's Straighten It Out. You're also seeing here one of my favorite aspects of this book that I actually did not create, in that my wife, who's a photographer, took contemporary portraits of the people who survived. And this is one of her pictures of this gentleman, Lattimore. You'll see here this little G clef earring dangling from his ear. That's his trademark. Another woman who wrote this hit song on her porch in Jacksonville, Jackie Moore. Very, very big song. She had several of them. She just passed away, unfortunately. She's from Florida. So here's another thing that I tried to do in the book, and that, you know, I was eager to point out all of the hugely successful music acts that came from Florida, but I also wanted to feature the sidemen, the people who got less attention, but are still very accomplished musicians and singers. So this gentleman who lives in Tampa, that's his house in Ybor City, which is the old cigar making quarter here. He played behind Ray Charles in the 1940s here in Tampa, played in a band together, and he worked with these other acts, but he was never the star, so to speak, because he was just a member of the horn section. I tell his story. Here's another woman who was not as famous, but very accomplished. She goes by Frankie Gearing, and she's from St. Petersburg. She actually came and sang at the launch party for my book, and that was terrific. She was the lead singer in several girl groups, as they used to call them. After the success of the Supremes, who you may remember, Diana Ross and the Supremes, producers thought they should put a group of 3 women together and try to imitate their success. So Frankie was a part of several of those groups. Here's a picture of her today in front of this nightclub in St. Petersburg, the Manhattan Casino, where she used to try to sneak in when she was too young. And she eventually went in there and heard all of the acts that came, like Little Richard and James Brown, and then went on to perform there herself. So here's some of her, one of her better known songs. Her group, Quiet Elegance, was managed by one of the Temptations, and they recorded for High Records in Memphis, which was the label that Al Green recorded for.
Mama said you're selling your soul to the devil. Papa said I'm living away with life. Brother said my self-respect is in danger. Girl, don't you know this man got a wife? They don't know what a lonely night can do. When a bad old mom's on you. They don't know it's pain to be. And no choice in the kind of love you got to steal.
So one of the things I encountered when I was doing this research that I wasn't really expecting was the role and the importance of soul music to the civil rights movement. I think most people would agree or would know that gospel music was a part of that movement. They both came out of the Black church. We know folk singers like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez contributed and wrote songs about civil rights. But soul performers also were part of it, and they performed at many of Dr. King's rallies. Here's one where Aretha Franklin and Dr. King. And you may remember her song, Respect. And so with her music, I want to point out, when you look at the rankings on the sales charts that I have below there, before this time, basically music was as segregated as the rest of society. And there was the rhythm and blues sales chart, which was Black music performed by Black entertainers for Black audiences. And there was the pop charts, or the Hot 100, which was white performers' music, bought almost entirely by white people. But what we see in the soul era is the combination and the crossover of these things. Here, when basically soul music becomes pop music. Sam and Dave here, you could see they're at the top or practically of both of these charts. Ray Charles actually put out a country album that was a best-selling album in the country at that time. So Black music, which had been segregated, kind of became and even take over the mainstream of music. James Brown had explicit songs that referenced the rights movement. And you could see here, I remember very well when this came out. There's a song by a Black guy saying that he is Black and he's proud. And not only is it the #1 selling rhythm and blues record, it's the 10th best-selling record in the country among what used to be a white market. So this crossover effect, we think, actually did some work in favor of the civil rights movement. Obviously, we still have a long way to go, but this is not my idea entirely. Dr. King actually spoke to this very point, and he did this at a convention of radio disc jockeys. And so here's what he told them.
Tonight, I want to say thank you, not just to these few, but to all of you who have given leadership to our people in thousands of unknown and unsung ways. We would certainly not have come so far without your support In a real sense, you have paved the way for social and political change by creating a powerful cultural bridge between black and white. School integration is much easier now that they share a common music, a common language, and enjoy the same dances. You introduced youth to that music and created the language of soul and promoted the dance which now sweeps across race, class, and nation.
So there you have it. I love the way he expresses this. The music was a powerful cultural bridge. And from my own experience, I think that's true. I don't know if anybody recognizes those artists there at the bottom of the screen, or I don't know if I could hear you if you could. Those are the Staple Singers. And that's Pop Staples and Mavis Staples there. One very successful protest song that did come out of Florida, and actually Sam and Dave were involved with Dr. King's movement too, and they performed at many of his rallies, and unfortunately at a memorial concert for him after he was killed in Madison Square Garden. But this gentleman had a #1 song that was very unusual in a couple of ways. For one, it wasn't the usual kind of popular music song, which is about love and romance and maybe sex. It was a protest song that was as successful as a pop song. And the other thing that's unusual about it is he is the only musician on the entire cut. It's just him and his B3 organ. And I interviewed Mr. Thomas. He's a chapter in my book, and it focuses on this song, Why Can't We Live Together? And he was driven to write it when he was watching Vietnam War footage on the nightly news with Walter Cronkite. And he was sort of despairing of what was going on there and all the people who were dying. And he wrote this song, and it became actually a global hit, and it became an anthem of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So Timmy went over there to South Africa and he performed this song while Nelson Mandela was in jail for a big stadium. And he insisted that it be integrated, and it was to a certain extent. And then several years later, he got a call to come back to South Africa, and he performed this song at Nelson Mandela's inauguration as the first Black president of South Africa. So it's a pretty amazing story.
Tell me why, tell me why, tell me why. Why can't we live together? Tell me why, tell me why. Why can't we live together? Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together? No more wars, no more wars, no more wars. Just a little peace in this world. No more wars, no more wars. All we want is some peace in this world. Everybody wants to live together. Why can't we live together?
So that song's been covered many times also by other artists, including Sade, Carlos Santana, Joan Osborne, and it's really endured, and it is 50 years old. Nope. So after a while, when I'm understanding that all of these great soul artists come from Florida, I had to try to figure out, well, why? Why is this a locus of soul music in this country, which means it's a soul capital of the world? So you're looking at one of the reasons right there on the screen, which you may recognize as the Marching 100 from FAMU. And And they have had for a long time, not just in the band, but also a great music program, including jazz. And quite a few people who are in my book came out of this music program. Here's one gentleman who had a lot of instrumental hits in the late 50s and early 60s from DeLand, Florida. He went by the Thin Man. This gentleman, who I also interviewed for my book, did play one of those drums in the marching band. And the joke is that his nickname is Pee Wee because he's actually quite small. And apparently he played the biggest drum. So I don't know why they put those two things together, but they did. So he and another alumnus of FAMU formed what we think is the first Black-owned record company in Florida, Deep City Records. And it was run out of the back of Johnny's record shop in Liberty City. So another reason that we think, and the people I talked to surmise, that Florida produced so much of this music was sort of a dual factor in terms of the entertainment venues. Florida was actually the most urbanized city in the South after World War II. And in those cities, you had urban nightclubs like this. Again, this is still in the time of segregation, so they're in the African-American neighborhoods. And you can see here, this is a pretty fancy place where people got dressed up to come on the weekend. There's a balcony. So in the cities, you found some elegant nightclubs where people that could actually afford to pay traveling musicians pretty well. Here's one in Jacksonville called the Two Spot, where supposedly the dance floor and the dance areas could hold 2,000 people. And at the same time, you know, Florida has always had agricultural workers, right? It was an urbanized and a ruralized state at the same time. And there was a much less expensive, less formal circuit of these juke joints throughout Florida that serviced both the people who pick tomatoes and the people who cut cane down south. And that was also a pretty lucrative circuit for many African-American performers. This gentleman here, Lavelle Kama, who I spoke to and is a chapter in my book, he said, well, the Chitlin circuit, as it's called, wasn't about making big money. It was about making steady money. You know, he could find these places and go from one to the other, up and down. This poster is actually from Georgia. So the circuit kind of extended through the South and all the way over to Texas. And if you started with your band, let's say at the top of Florida or around Pensacola, you could work your way all the way down through some of these urban places and some of these country places, and then work your way all the way back up. And many musical groups did that. You may see at the very bottom here, there's a reference to the band backing him up called the 100-Hour Counts, which is kind of an odd name. And it turns out the name comes from a publicity stunt that they once did in Fort Lauderdale, in which they played 100 hours straight. So after that, they became the 100-Hour Counts. Here's another woman who got her start on that Chitlin circuit, singing with black bands. And this song, she was invited to record this song in Memphis. The Vault label that you see here is a subsidiary of Stax, which is the very famous soul label. And this is a song that was also covered several times, so you may recognize it. Her name was Linda Lindell, and this is from 1968.
See
So, as I said, she got her start on the Chitlin circuit in Florida. She's from a rural area outside of Gainesville. But the unusual thing about her is that she was actually a nice white lady. She grew up singing in the black church like almost every other soul singer, and that's where she lived. And her parents didn't want to go to church at all, so she just walked over to this church and they accepted her. It turns out she has a great voice. So she fronted Lavelle Kama's band that I showed you earlier that traveled the Chitlin circuit. She was one of the very, very few white performers. And as Mr. Kama, her employer, told me, she was kind of an oddity and therefore sort of an attraction. And then when people heard her sing, they were doubly attracted. So she's a chapter in the book. Another white performer, some of you may remember, was this gentleman. He had several hits and he was a really good singer, really good dancer. His idol was James Brown. Sometimes he was billed as the white James Brown. He later, when he retired from music, he became a preacher. He still had the performing skills. So I went down to South Florida and I saw him preach and I interviewed him about his career, and he's a chapter in the book as well. So, you know, after I was trying to figure out why Florida was such a rich soul region, then I lastly said, well, why does nobody know about it? I mean, I knew why I didn't know about it coming from New York, but I don't think many people anywhere know that Florida is a soul capital. So one reason is that, sorry, unlike, let's say Detroit, almost every Motown artist recorded with the same musicians behind them, and there was a very distinctive Motown sound. There were tambourines and there were other musical things that were very consistent. The vocalists changed, they were great and had a lot of variety, but there was one sound. In Memphis, the Stax sound and the high music sound that Frankie Gearing recorded for, they're very recognizable with organ, a certain kind of guitar, some Latin percussion. But in Florida, there are many different styles, maybe because it's such a big state and not a city. And I think that has kept people from understanding that all of these artists cohere into a Florida soul heritage. So I'm gonna play a little bit more Sam and Dave and then contrast it with another Florida act so you could see, or you could hear what I mean.
Don't you ever be sad. Me on and can't get back. And the doctor, I know you die. And I will trouble. Give out to the hold on.
Okay, that was pretty hard driving soul. These two great singers belting it out. Then contrast that with another duo from Florida, based in Pensacola, James and Bobby Purify. And I interviewed them both, and they are a chapter in the book as well. So here's their biggest hit, which you may remember, but think also about comparing it or contrasting it to the Sam and Dave sound.
Full screen, and I wink at you. I'm your puppet. I'll do funny things if you want me to. I'm your puppet. I'm yours.
So quite different, right? This is like light, poppy. There's even a glockenspiel in there. I mean, completely different sound and production. When I interviewed Sam Moore, he talked about there were rivals, these two duos, and he said James and Bobby sang real harmony, but what he and Dave Prater did was more like the call and response that you hear in the black church between the preacher and the congregation. That they alternated, but they didn't sing harmony, but these two guys did. So anyway, there's two very different sounds that both have Florida roots. Here's Mr. Purified today at his house in Pensacola, another picture that my wife took. So in the south of Florida also, maybe not surprisingly, there is some Latin influences that you can hear in the music that you would certainly not hear in the soul music of Detroit, for example, or even Pensacola. This gentleman is a guitar player originally from Arkansas, had a long career in Miami. His name is Willie Hale. And in an interview, he said that he thought just being in Miami and hearing the music around him all the time, that he absorbed some of the Latin rhythms and he adapted them and adopted them into his version of soul music. So I'm going to play a song that he wrote the music for. He plays two guitar parts that you're going to hear at once. And if you listen for this rhythm, well, here, I'll play it for you and then I'll describe what I think is going on. And see if you recognize the song. He's not the singer.
A clean-up woman is a woman who gets all the love we girls leave behind. The reason I know so much about her is because she picked up a man of mine. Jumping slick was my woman, 'cause I found out was making it easy for the clean-up woman to get my first love. Oh yeah, just making it easy for the clean-up woman.
Okay, so that was Betty Wright singing this song, which also was a big crossover hit. I think she was 17 when that came out, and I don't think she's ever had a hit that big, but she's been very successful. So if you remember the way that song starts, there's this kind of rhythm with the guitar that goes boom, 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 boom. So people who know more about Latin music than I do tell me it's very similar to the clave beat that you hear in a lot of different forms of Latin music. So that was something that Willie Hale absorbed in the atmosphere in Miami. Another thing that we see in South Florida that we don't see in other soul cities or regions of the country is Caribbean flavor. I don't know if anybody knows what junkanoo is or means. I can't see if you're raising your hand or not, but junkanoo is a Bahamian kind of music that was created around the annual Junkanoo Festival. And there's parades with a lot of people playing percussion, there's horns, there's whistles, and all of these things were absorbed by KC and the Sunshine Band. They tried to replicate what they were hearing in Miami, where there's a big Bahamian population, and the original name of their group was KC and the Sunshine Junkanoo Band. So they are entirely derived from this Caribbean kind of music. Of course, they took it in their own direction. Another Bahamian hit that came out of Florida was this song called Funky Nassau. I think that's one reason why Florida soul had not been recognized. I'm hoping that maybe that'll change a little bit with the book, and I was lucky enough to get some national attention for it. I think Jill mentioned it was in the Wall Street Journal, so we'll see. So I think we might have made some headway there, and there are people who are still keeping Florida Soul alive. One of them is Sam Moore of Sam and Dave. Dave Prater is deceased, but Sam here, he is still performing. He's in his early 80s and he still sounds great. I saw him performing at the White House for President and Mrs. Obama some time ago. And he and his wife, Joyce, they're actually on the faculty at FIU in Miami, where they're teaching young people about their soul heritage. So they are really keeping it alive. They may even have joined us tonight. I hope so. There's a great singer out of Gainesville, Little Jake Mitchell, still touring in his 70s, sounds great. He played at the launch party for my book in St. Petersburg. It's a woman named Betty Paget in Miami who's terrific. Worked in a little bit about her in the book. And now there's a young guy out of Lauderdale who calls himself Urban Mystic. And he does some of today's R&B that is actually not my favorite, but he also is recording and he's maintaining the classic soul songs. He put out a whole album of those songs and he's got a great voice. So here's another reason I'm hoping that maybe Florida's soul heritage is getting some recognition, which is there's a new housing development in our city. And there are two streets called Hank Ballard Street, after the gentleman who wrote The Twist, after seeing it done in Tampa, and Ray Charles, who lived here for several years in the 40s, recorded his first song here. So I think this might be a little bit of a sign that the recognition may be late, but it's coming for the soul music of Florida. So I'd be happy to take any questions, and I hope you could hear me and more importantly, hear the music okay.
All right, thank you, John, for that wonderful presentation. This is Erin Muir, and I'm going to be moderating the final segment of our lecture. As Jill mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we are pleased to be able to offer the opportunity to purchase autographed and inscribed copies of John's book, Florida Soul, From Ray Charles to KC and the Sunshine Band. You can visit our website, keysdiscovery.com, and on our lectures page, there's a link to place an order. We'll be taking orders through Wednesday, April 29th, and after the order window closes, we'll forward those on to John, and he'll personalize inscriptions and mail the books directly to each purchaser. The link to order will also be sent to you all in an email following tonight's lecture. So we are now going to move into the question and answer portion of tonight's program. If you would like to ask a question, you may use your raise hand button. I will be able to see everyone who has a hand raised and will call on you to ask your question. When I call on you, I will unmute your microphone. When I do this, you should get a notification that says something along the lines of, the organizer has unmuted you, would you like to unmute? And select yes. If you don't see this notification, you can always check your mute status by looking at your microphone button. If there's a slash line through it, you're muted, or if it's red in color on many devices, and a microphone with no slash and green on many devices means your mic is on for everyone to hear. If someone else asks your question or you change your mind about asking your question, hit your raise hand button again and it will lower your virtual hand. Or you can always type in your question in the questions panel like we reviewed at the start of the webinar, and I will read your question to John. All right, let's give this a shot. I'm going to give folks a chance to find their raise hand button and go ahead and start with a question that was typed in by Vivian Morrison. And Vivian would like to know, what is the name of the song that St. Pete adopted as their official tune?
Okay, thank you. It's the St. Pete, Florida Blues.
Okay.
And it's hard to find. It's a pretty obscure recording that he made down in Miami in 1949 or 1950. But it's out there.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Oh, Marie DeLuca. Marie, I've unmuted you. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, my question is, you seem to enjoy all the music that you were playing and sort of moving around with it. So is your degree in music or is it your degree in history? I know you teach at Tampa University. I'm just a little bit interested in your background.
Well, thank you. I am my degree is in journalism, and I'm an amateur blues harmonica player, and I don't know a lot of music theory. I can't read music.
It was so interesting.
I enjoy it more than I understand it. But one of the great things about writing this book was I spoke to a lot of people who do know a lot more about it, and so I was able to come to understand some of the musical structures, the chord changes, and things like that. So you know, I really love finding that stuff out. But thank you for your question.
All right. Do we have any other questions? You can either type it in the question box and I'll see it pop up and read it to John, or you can use your raise hand feature. I think we've covered it all. So don't forget, you can purchase a copy of John's book and dive into all of the interesting people that he talked about in tonight's lecture. And I've got a couple more notes for you all before we sign off. This lecture has been recorded and we will upload it to our YouTube channel and share it through our Facebook page as well. Like I mentioned, you will receive a follow-up email. It's going to include a brief survey about your experience with tonight's lecture. This is a survey from Florida Humanities that they ask us to do under the terms of our grant we received from them. So your participation is greatly appreciated. If you are on our email list, you will receive an email with the registration link for the next lecture on Wednesday, April 29th. And that comes out the Monday before the lecture. Or registration links are already available on our keysdiscovery.com website and our Facebook page. So if you're already planning on attending, you can go ahead and get registered. John, I did want to pass along one more comment that's come in through the question box from Mark.
Great.
And Mark just wanted to relay thanks for writing this book. Very excited to hear about it. So.
Oh, well, that's great. You know, that's great to hear. As I said, this was a 5-year labor of love, and you know, it was gratifying to do, but it's always really gratifying if someone appreciates it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that'll do it for us this evening. I hope you all have a great evening, and don't forget to tune in to tomorrow's virtual visit with our curator, Brad Bertelli, via Facebook Live. That's tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And if we don't see you between now and our next lecture, we hope you'll join us for our next lecture with our curator, Brad Bertelli, in 2 weeks. Have a great night.
Good night.